You know what's fascinating? There's a 2,000-year-old Roman emperor who never intended to become one of history's greatest spiritual teachers. Marcus Aurelius was too busy running an empire, fighting wars, and dealing with plagues to worry about his spiritual awakening. Yet his private journal, never meant for publication, became one of the most profound guides to inner freedom ever written. And here's the kicker, he was spiritually blocked too. In fact, some of his most powerful insights came from recognizing exactly why he felt disconnected from his own wisdom. Sound familiar? You meditate sometimes? Maybe. You've read the books, watched the videos, maybe even gone to that retreat. You know you're more than just your thoughts and emotions. You know there's something deeper calling to you. So why does it still feel like you're trying to tune into a radio station through static? By the end of this exploration, you'll understand the 3 hidden barriers that are keeping you spiritually stuck, barriers so subtle that most people spend decades unaware they even exist. But more importantly, you'll discover the ancient antidote that dissolves these blocks faster than you might think possible. Let me start with a question that might sting a bit. What if your spiritual seeking is exactly what's blocking your spiritual growth? I know. That sounds like one of those annoying paradoxes spiritual teachers love to throw around. But stick with me here, because this isn't mystical wordplay, it's practical psychology disguised as ancient wisdom. Here's what's happening. You've turned spirituality into another project. Another thing to achieve, optimize, and perfect. You're approaching the infinite with the same mindset you used to improve your golf swing or learn a new language. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say you have power over your spiritual experiences, your meditation quality, or your level of enlightenment. Think about it. When was the last time you sat in meditation without unconsciously grading your performance? When did you last read spiritual text without comparing your understanding to where you think you should be? The Stoics had a term for this. Preferred indifference. Things that seem important but actually have no bearing on your essential well-being. Your spiritual experiences? Often just preferred indifference in disguise. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is your first open loop that we'll return to later. The very thing that's blocking you might be the doorway itself. The frustration, the seeking, the spiritual restlessness. What if these aren't obstacles to overcome but messages to decode? We'll unpack that coded message in a few minutes. But first, you need to understand why your mind has become your own worst enemy in this journey. Let's talk about something no one wants to admit. Spiritual pride. You know that subtle feeling of superiority when someone mentions they're stressed and you think, if only they meditated like I do. Or that quiet disappointment when your meditation doesn't reach the level you achieved last week. Congratulations. You've just met your spiritual ego. The ancient Greeks called this hubris, the kind of pride that makes you forget you're human. But spiritual hubris is particularly sneaky because it disguises itself as growth. It whispers. You're more conscious than them. You understand things they don't. You're on the path. Slight chuckle in tone. Epictetus, who went from slave to sage, had the perfect cure for this. He said, wealth consists in not having great possessions, but in having few wants. Replace wealth with spiritual attainment, and you've got the antidote to spiritual materialism. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface, and this might surprise you. Your spiritual ego isn't actually about spirituality. It's about safety. Think about it. In a world that often feels chaotic and meaningless, claiming spiritual insight gives you a sense of control, purpose, and identity. I may not understand my job, my relationships, or my future, but at least I understand consciousness. The problem. This need for spiritual certainty actually closes you off to the mystery that real spirituality is pointing toward. I once knew someone who spent years studying non-dual philosophy. Could quote Roman Emperor, explain the illusion of the ego, discuss the nature of consciousness with impressive precision. But ask him to sit quietly for 5 minutes without analyzing his experience, and he'd fidget like a child in church. He had turned awakening into a concept to grasp rather than a reality to surrender to. The Stoics had a practice that completely dissolves spiritual ego. It's called the discipline of desire. But it's not what you think. We'll explore this practice when we get to the solutions. But first you need to understand how your relationship with time is secretly sabotaging your spiritual growth. Here's a preview though. What if I told you that the moment you stop trying to get somewhere spiritually is the moment you realize you were always already there? What would that mean for how you approach your practice tomorrow morning? But before we can unwrap that mystery, we need to understand why you've been approaching spirituality backwards from the beginning. Pop quiz. When will you be enlightened? If your mind just produced any answer other than "this question doesn't make sense," you've just discovered your second major spiritual block. You're living in what I call the someday syndrome. Someday I'll be peaceful. Someday I'll understand. Someday I'll transcend these patterns. Someday I'll feel connected to the divine. Meanwhile, the only moment in which peace, understanding, or divine connection could possibly exist is being systematically ignored in favor of a fantasy future. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." Not because the present is more spiritual than the future, but because the present is the only place where experience actually occurs. But here's the deeper issue. You've been conditioned to believe that spiritual development follows the same timeline as material development. Learn the techniques, put in the hours, accumulate insights, achieve results. This is like trying to fall asleep by effort. The harder you try, the more elusive it becomes. Let me share something that might sound controversial. There's no such thing as spiritual progress. I know. Your meditation app tracks your streak. You feel more peaceful than you did 5 years ago. You understand concepts now that used to confuse you. But here's what the mystics knew that the self-help industry doesn't want you to discover. All genuine spiritual realization is the recognition of what was already present. You don't develop peace, you stop obscuring it. You don't achieve connection, you stop believing in separation. The Zen tradition has a perfect metaphor. You are the sky. Thoughts, emotions, and experiences are clouds. You don't become the sky by getting rid of the clouds. You recognize you were always the sky, regardless of what clouds happen to be passing through. This is where it gets practically interesting. When you stop trying to get somewhere spiritually, something remarkable happens. You start noticing what's actually here. And what's actually here is far more extraordinary than anything you were trying to achieve. But, and here's another open loop we'll return to, there's a specific practice that makes this shift from seeking to being almost instantaneous. The Stoics used it daily, but it's been largely forgotten by modern spiritual seekers. Before I reveal that practice, though, you need to understand the most insidious block of all. It's the one that makes you believe that your thoughts and feelings are more real than they actually are. Here's a question that will reveal everything. Who would you be without your problems? Don't answer too quickly. Really consider it. Without your anxiety, your spiritual seeking, your relationship drama, your career concerns, your family history, your political opinions. Who would you be? If that question feels scary or empty, you've just discovered your deepest spiritual block. You've confused your experience with your identity. The Stoics called this prohairesis, your faculty of choice, your essential self that exists prior to and independent of all circumstances. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire philosophical practice learning to distinguish between what he was and what was merely happening to him. But here's what's fascinating. Most people are more afraid of losing their problems than solving them. Because without your familiar patterns of thinking and feeling, who would you be? I once worked with someone who had been anxious for so long that when they finally experienced a day without anxiety, they became anxious about not being anxious. They literally didn't recognize themselves in a state of peace. Your spiritual blocks aren't just obstacles to overcome, they're false identities you're afraid to release. Here's what no one tells you about spiritual awakening. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about discovering what remains when you stop pretending to be someone old. The Stoic Emperor Aurelius put it perfectly. How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself. Replace neighbor with thoughts and feelings. And you've got the secret to spiritual freedom. Remember when I said that your spiritual seeking might be the doorway itself? Here's what I meant. Every time you seek peace, you're actually acknowledging that peace is possible. Every time you seek connection, you're recognizing connection as your true nature. The seeking isn't the problem. The belief that you don't already have what you're seeking, that's the prison. But here's the remarkable thing. The moment you truly understand these three blocks, spiritual ego, time delusion, and identity prison, they begin to dissolve automatically. Understanding is the beginning of freedom. And there are specific practices, refined over centuries, that accelerate this dissolution. Let's explore them. So how do you dissolve blocks that you've probably been carrying for years? The answer is surprisingly simple, but it requires a complete reversal of how you've been approaching spirituality. First, the Stoic antidote to spiritual ego. The discipline of desire. But not the way you think. Epictetus taught his students to want what happens, rather than trying to make what they want happen. Applied to spirituality. Want whatever level of peace, clarity, or connection you're experiencing right now. This isn't passive resignation. It's radical acceptance that becomes the foundation for genuine transformation. When you stop fighting your current spiritual state, you free up the energy that was locked in resistance. Try this tomorrow morning. Instead of sitting down to meditate with the goal of becoming peaceful, sit down already complete. Meditate as someone who is already whole, rather than someone trying to become whole. Notice the difference in the quality of attention that emerges. The antidote to time delusion is what Marcus Aurelius called present moment awareness. But he practiced it in a very specific way. He would constantly remind himself, loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight. Translation. This moment, exactly as it is the only spiritual teacher you'll ever need. Your resistance to this moment is the only thing blocking you from recognizing its perfection. Here's the practice. Throughout your day, especially when you notice yourself seeking or wanting or trying to improve spiritually, ask yourself, what if this exact moment is exactly what I need for my awakening? Not as a belief, but as an experiment. What changes in your relationship to experience when you approach it this way? And the antidote to identity prison. The Stoics called it the discipline of assent, learning to distinguish between what happens and what you make what happens mean. When anxiety arises, instead of thinking, I am anxious, you learn to observe. Anxiety is present. When peace is absent, instead of concluding, I'm not spiritual enough, you notice. Peace is currently not in my experience. This isn't just word play. It's the difference between being the weather and being the sky. The sky doesn't become stormy when storms pass through it. But here's the most radical realization of all. The moment you truly understand that you are not your experience, you discover that you were never actually blocked. You were just misidentifying yourself with the temporary states that were passing through your awareness. Let me leave you with something that might change everything. What if there's nowhere to go because you're already there? Marcus Aurelius, in the middle of running an empire, dealing with plagues, and fighting wars, wrote, very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. He wasn't writing from a monastery or after years of meditation retreats. He was writing from the battlefield of ordinary life, discovering that the sacred was never separate from the mundane. Your spiritual blocks aren't obstacles on the path. They're invitations to discover that there was never actually a path. There's only this, awareness, being aware of itself, recognizing itself in every experience. The peace you're seeking is the peace you're seeking from. The connection you want to find is the connection that's looking. The awareness you're trying to cultivate is the awareness that's already aware of your effort to cultivate it. So here's my challenge. For the next week, stop trying to get anywhere spiritually. Instead, get curious about what's already here. Not as a technique, but as an experiment in reality. Stop seeking the extraordinary and start noticing that the ordinary is extraordinary. Stop trying to transcend your humanity and start exploring what it means to be fully human. The path of awareness isn't about becoming aware. It's about recognizing that you are awareness itself, temporarily forgetting yourself in the play of experience, then remembering again. And sometimes, the most profound remembering happens in the moment you stop trying to remember. What will you discover when you stop seeking and start being? The pathless path is always available. Not as something to walk, but as something you are.